Let's introduce the CEO, a powerful, cold man with a complicated history with women. He's known for being ruthless in the business world, but behind his facade of success, he hides a deep disdain for women. He sees them all as inferior, mere tools to be used in his power game. On the other side, we have the married woman who somehow catches the attention of this CEO. She is successful in her own right, married to an influential man, but her personal life is far from perfect. The story will begin with an event that brings the two into contact, perhaps a business meeting, where the CEO finds himself inexplicably drawn to her, and the tension between them begins to grow. The CEO, although he detests women, sees in this woman a chance to gain total control over someone, which motivates him to try to seduce her using any means necessary. This creates a dangerous game of power and desire, where he will cross boundaries, manipulating the situation to transform this woman into his mistress. Edward Miller, CEO of one of the country's most powerful conglomerates, was a well-known figure in business circles. His name was synonymous with success, but also with coldness, a man who never showed affection and whose disdain for women had made him unpopular with many. Throughout his career, he had learned to use the people around him to ensure his rise, without ever allowing himself to be involved with feelings. His office, on one of the highest floors of a modern building in central London, was a reflection of his personality, minimalist, cold, and impersonal. Despite his high status, Edward harbored a peculiar disdain for women. In his mind, they were weak beings, necessary only for the traditional roles of wives and mothers. But at the same time, he couldn't deny that there was something mesmerizing about them, especially some women who proved defiant. The attraction he felt for them wasn't based on affection, but on control. And paradoxically, this fueled his desire. However, everything began to change when he saw her for the first time. Caroline, a married woman, mother of two, and wife of an influential politician, was invited to a strategic meeting, a partnership her husband had negotiated with Edward's company. She was there not for her beauty, which wasn't extravagant but subtly charming, but for her intelligence. During the meeting, Caroline displayed a calmness and confidence that stood out among all the others present. Unlike many women he was used to seeing, she didn't seek to please him or play the seduction game so many others attempted. She was the type of woman who wasn't intimidated by his fame or power. However, Caroline's confidence wasn't solely due to inner strength. She had her own conflicts. Her marriage, despite being to a powerful man, was distant and cold. Her husband, a successful politician, was rarely home, absorbed in his career. This left Caroline in a vulnerable position, more than she cared to admit. Although she loved her children, loneliness and a lack of passion had begun to erode her marriage, making her more susceptible to external tensions and attractions. This woman, intelligent, strong, and at the same time in a delicate situation, came to be seen by Edward not as a wife, but as a trophy to be won, someone over whom he could finally demonstrate his absolute control. He convinced himself that if he could seduce her, he would have won his own personal game against women, proving his superiority. Edward knew that the only way to win Caroline over was by attacking where she was most vulnerable, her personal life. He started with small gestures, almost imperceptible to others, but powerful for Caroline. A discreet compliment here, a shrewd observation about her marriage there, and the constant suggestion that she could have more than just the life she was leading. Little by little, he cornered her, cornering her so she could no longer ignore the growing tension between them. Caroline, initially suspicious, soon realized that something was changing in Edward's behavior. He seemed interested not only in the success of the business, but also in her, in a more intimate way. Sometimes he observed her for longer than necessary, with a look that didn't disguise his insane curiosity, but also his need for control. She knew what he wanted, or thought she knew, And despite that, she couldn't distance herself from him. It was as if he had a magnetic power over her, something she couldn't avoid, even though she knew she should. As the weeks passed, Edward continued to circle her, finding ways to infiltrate her life. He began sending expensive gifts and flowers for no reason, always accompanied by an enigmatic message, as if he knew more about her than anyone else. He made her feel special and unique, but also manipulated, as if she were falling into a game she couldn't escape. On the other hand, Caroline tried to maintain her composure. She loved her husband, but the emotional and physical needs he wasn't meeting were beginning to take their toll. Her marriage was slowly dying, and the lack of attention and affection had left her vulnerable. Loneliness consumed her, and however much she tried to resist, she felt drawn to Edward's power and seduction. He knew exactly how to exploit her weaknesses. The game was being played so subtly that no one else around them noticed what was happening. Edward, with his calculating coldness, and Caroline, with her inner struggle, were dancing to a melody they both knew was dangerous. In one of their business meetings, Edward was bolder. During a seemingly casual conversation, he mentioned, with an expression bordering on provocation, that he knew how unsatisfying Caroline's life was. She looked at him, surprised, and tried to hide her discomfort. But inside, his words began to resonate. How did he know that? How did he know about her feelings of frustration and abandonment? She couldn't stop thinking about Edward, and at the same time, she hated feeling vulnerable. But the situation took an even more complicated turn. Edward, with his subtle manipulation, made Caroline find herself in a position where she needed his help. He offered seemingly selfless support for a problem she was facing at work. And as always, she knew there was an ulterior motive behind this gesture, but at the same time, she couldn't deny that she felt it might be the only way out of her emotional prison. Caroline had always known that her marriage was marked by a growing distance. She loved him, but it wasn't the same love as before. Her husband, William, a respected British politician, was deeply immersed in his career. They had married young, and he had, over time, become a public figure with little time for his personal life. Their meetings were sporadic, usually formal, and there was rarely room for intimacy. The physical and emotional distance began to erode Caroline's marriage. She knew her husband was committed to politics, but she also felt he had forgotten his wife, and the unspoken words between them began to weigh heavily. Caroline tried to fill this void with her children, with friends, and even with her work, but nothing seemed enough. However, the relationship with Edward was becoming a dangerous distraction. Caroline knew she was approaching a fine line, and the guilt of thinking about another man, of beginning to desire something her husband could no longer offer, tormented her. She was torn between loyalty to her husband and the undeniable desire for Edward, a man who represented everything she lacked at home: power, control, and the promise of something more. But Caroline's relationship with William was proving more complex than she had imagined. William wasn't entirely unaware of what was happening in his marriage. He knew his wife wasn't happy, but somehow he didn't want to, or didn't know how to, change their dynamic. Perhaps it was the fear of losing the position he so cherished, or perhaps a failure to perceive what was truly at stake. He was trapped in his own ambition, which prevented him from realizing that Caroline was growing increasingly distant. This, of course, only helped Edward in his game. Caroline's weakness and the delicate state of her marriage were a perfect window of opportunity for him. He knew that by suggesting small moments of attention, care, and pleasure that William was no longer able to offer, he could corrupt Caroline's trust. One night, Caroline found herself in an emotional and moral dilemma. After a bitter argument with William about his absence, she was approached by Edward. He invited her to dinner, where the words became even heavier, as if everything she feared was about to be revealed. During the conversation, Edward subtly teased her, questioning whether she truly knew what she wanted from her life. He suggested that she deserved more than the neglected wife life she was living, that she deserved to be desired, loved, and that he could offer her that. Caroline, who had closed herself off to these feelings for so long, now found herself at the mercy of her own emotions and insecurities. At that moment, the tension between them was palpable, but something else emerged. A bond of understanding. She knew she was on the verge of a crucial decision. She looked at Edward, no longer as the man who wanted to seduce her, but as the key to something deeper, something she couldn't yet fully understand. What he offered was dangerous, but also exciting. She didn't know how to shake off this attraction growing inside her. At the same time, Edward was playing a more subtle psychological game. He didn't just want to be Caroline's lover. He wanted to be her only option. He wanted to prove to himself that, with his power, he could destroy any resistance she might have, forcing her to surrender completely. Caroline didn't know what was consuming her. The attraction to Edward had turned into an obsession she could no longer control. She avoided him, tried to keep her distance, but the magnetism he exerted over her was beyond what she imagined. It was as if each encounter with him was a battle she was always losing, without the strength to fight against what he represented. One afternoon, after another tense day with her husband, Caroline found herself facing Edward again, who was more insidious than ever. He invited her to a social event, a gala organized by his company. It was the perfect chance for them to meet outside of a professional setting, in a more intimate and less restrictive environment. What began as a simple business invitation turned into a psychological game of seduction and manipulation. Edward knew what he wanted. He knew Caroline was on the verge of giving in, and he was determined to make it happen. The gala night would be the turning point. When Caroline arrived at the event, the air was already thick with tension. Edward awaited her in the center of the room, his gaze speaking louder than words could express. They exchanged casual words, but something was different that night. Caroline sensed the game had changed. It was then that Edward led her to a more secluded spot, out of everyone's sight, where the pressure of his presence became unbearable. He looked at her with undeniable intensity, and for the first time, Caroline felt completely vulnerable. She knew there was no turning back. It was there or never. "Do you want to know what it's really like to feel alive?" Edward said, his voice low and laden with a promise she knew was dangerous. Caroline hesitated for a moment, but something inside her pushed her toward the decision. Desire was burning in her chest, and the fear of losing herself in that feeling no longer seemed as important as the promise of something she had never experienced. She looked at Edward, their eyes meeting electrically, and finally said, "Yes." What happened next was a moment of pure surrender. Edward didn't force her, but the game was clear. He wrapped her in his arms, and the kiss that followed was more than a simple exchange of caresses. It was an assertion of power, a seal on a pact that had been sealed long ago. Caroline felt lost, but at the same time, something inside her told her that this choice would define her forever. However, what Caroline didn't know was that that kiss wouldn't just be the beginning of a forbidden relationship. When she pulled away from Edward, trying to process what had just happened, she saw him look at his phone. Edward's face turned serious. He touched her shoulder, interrupting the moment, and said, with a coldness that left no doubt, "I hope you understand that there are consequences to this choice. Your husband isn't as blind as you think. He already knows." The impact of those words hit Caroline like a blow. Her mind couldn't process it immediately, but something in Edward's expression said it all. He had played his own power game once again, and she had just become a key piece in that game. Now it wasn't just about desire anymore. It was about exposure, about the consequences of her actions. Edward, in his manipulation, had placed her in a position where her decision would affect not only her marriage, but her entire life. She was trapped in a web of betrayal, from which, it seemed, she could no longer escape. Caroline couldn't sleep. That night, after the kiss with Edward, she found herself consumed by guilt and anxiety. Her mind was torn between the overwhelming desire for him and the feeling of betrayal that gnawed at her heart. How could she have given herself so easily? How could she have put her life, her marriage, and her family at risk for a momentary impulse? But what troubled her most was the coldness with which Edward had handled the situation. He showed no pleasure in his conquest, but rather a cold calculation, as if she were merely a pawn in his game. This made her even more vulnerable, as she didn't know how far he was willing to go to achieve his goals. The next day, Caroline faced William, her husband, as if nothing had happened. He, as always, was distracted by his own problems, and Caroline, with a forced smile, tried to maintain an appearance of normalcy. But there was something in his eyes that made her feel uneasy. William seemed suspicious, as if he knew something Caroline couldn't control. "Caroline," he said in one of their rare, candid conversations, "I know you're not okay. What's happening to us? What are you hiding?" Caroline didn't know what to say. She wanted to tell the truth, but something inside her held her back. The fear of the consequences, the fear of losing everything, kept her silent. With each word from William, she felt the weight of what she had done grow even heavier. Meanwhile, Edward was one step away from completely turning the tables in his favor. He knew Caroline was uncomfortable with what had happened, but he also knew she couldn't back down. His manipulation wasn't just physical, but psychological, and he had complete control over the situation. He began sending more messages, more invitations, more help that kept Caroline trapped in the labyrinth he had created. "Did you know that your life would never be the same after what we did?" he said one morning, in a casual tone, as if it were a simple observation. Caroline felt a chill. He was right. Her life had changed forever, and she had no idea how to escape this emotional prison. Her interactions with Edward had become increasingly intense and manipulative, and she found herself trapped in a seemingly endless cycle of desire and guilt. What Caroline didn't know was that William, though distracted by politics, had noticed something. He wasn't as naive as she thought. He knew his wife was distancing herself, and contrary to what she imagined, he wasn't entirely unaware of what was happening. In a moment of clarity, he confronted Caroline directly, demanding answers. "I know something is going on. Look me in the eyes and tell me there's no one else. Tell me you're not involved with him," William demanded, his tone a mixture of anger and despair. Caroline, unable to lie, looked at him, and for the first time in a long time, saw the man she used to love. The pain in his eyes hit her like a punch. She knew she could no longer hide the truth. With Caroline's silent confession, the tension in the air increased. William, devastated, stared at her for a long moment without saying a word. He knew that by losing his wife, he would also lose part of his own identity. The public image he valued so much was at risk, and in his eyes, Caroline saw not only her wounded husband, but also the man who knew that his life was now divided between maintaining appearances or facing the truth. Caroline sat alone on the park bench, the cold London breeze brushing against her face. The city around her continued to move, but she was frozen, immersed in a whirlwind of thoughts. Her marriage was in tatters. She had lost her husband's trust, and the relationship with Edward, however attractive, left her with an inner emptiness she couldn't fill. She looked at the birds flying in the grey sky, but she didn't feel freedom. On the contrary, she felt more imprisoned than ever. What had happened to her? How had she let herself be carried away by this dangerous game? What drove her to surrender to Edward, even knowing that he was only playing with her? As she pondered all of this, a feeling of regret began to overwhelm her. Caroline realized that, although she was deeply involved with Edward, what she needed most wasn't him. It was herself. She could no longer lose herself in her own insecurities and the desire to fill the void in her marriage with something that was destroying her. However, the transformation wouldn't be easy. Edward still had a strong presence in her life, and he wasn't willing to let her go so easily. He kept texting, showing up at her work, making himself present in every way. But this time, Caroline was no longer willing to be a pawn in his game. Caroline made a decision. She would no longer be a puppet in Edward's hands, nor an unhappy wife in a marriage without a future. She knew she needed to do something radical, something that would take her out of the comfort zone she had created over the years. The next day she sought out a lawyer. It wasn't easy, and the weight of her past actions haunted her, but she knew she needed to take control. She wanted a separation from William, not because she no longer loved him, but because she needed to find herself alone, without depending on anyone to define who she was. When William learned of Caroline's decision, he wasn't surprised, but it felt like a sharp blade piercing his heart. They sat together, and the conversation was painful. William looked at her with a mixture of anger and sadness, but he also knew he couldn't force Caroline to stay in a relationship she had already emotionally abandoned. "I never thought it would come to this," he said, trying to control the pain in his voice. "But if this is what you want, if this is what you need, then go." Caroline looked at him with a heavy heart. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was the one she knew she needed to make. It wasn't about revenge or anger. It was about finding the peace and independence she had lost long ago. Over time, Caroline began to feel stronger. She stopped hiding behind her insecurities and stepped out of Edward's shadow. The process of rebuilding her life was long, but she began to realize that she was more than capable of moving forward on her own. She no longer needed a man to control her to feel valued. She knew that the greatest power lay within herself. She finally made the decision to completely distance herself from Edward. It didn't happen all at once, but with each choice she made, she gained more control over her destiny. It wouldn't be easy to erase everything that had happened, but she was ready to try. Caroline was at home, now a place where she felt at peace, but still with the echo of Edward in her mind. She knew he wouldn't stay quiet forever. Edward, with his characteristic arrogance, couldn't tolerate losing. He didn't understand that his manipulation had failed. To him, Caroline was still a pawn to be dominated, and he was determined to bring her back into his game. However, something had changed in her. Caroline knew he was coming, and she was prepared. She had been weakened by his actions, yes, but she had also become stronger. He didn't know it, but she had matured, and now she no longer saw his lust for power as something that attracted her. On the contrary, it was repulsive. Edward appeared late in the afternoon, as always, impeccably dressed in his suit, with a predatory grin on his face. He knew the scene was set, that Caroline was on the verge of giving in. He hoped that his mere presence would be enough to make her change her mind, surrender to him one last time. But he was wrong. "I knew you would come," Caroline said, her voice firm, but not without a certain sadness. "I knew you wouldn't give up on me so easily." Edward smiled, believing he still had the upper hand. "You're stronger than I thought, Caroline, but make no mistake, this isn't over. You know what we have can't be denied." Caroline looked at him, and for the first time, she felt no desire to give in. It wasn't a matter of revenge, but of liberation. She stood up, walking towards him with her head held high. "No, Edward," she said with surprising calm. "I'm not yours anymore, and I'm not even my own person anymore if I continue to let you manipulate me. This was all a game for you, but for me, it was a lesson. I learned to pick myself up." Edward frowned. Something that rarely happened. He wasn't prepared for that response. He had always been in control of others, always manipulated, always been the winner. But there, before him, Caroline was showing him that he no longer had dominion over her. He had underestimated her. "Do you think you can beat me, Caroline?" Edward asked, his tone growing more menacing. "I am what you've always wanted, and if I can't have you, I will destroy what's left." Caroline, without hesitation, made a decisive move. "You can't destroy what's already destroyed. What I lost was just an illusion. Now what I have is control over my own life, and believe me, you're not the one who will determine my future." The tension in the air was palpable. Edward, who had always controlled everything with his words and actions, now stood before a woman who had broken free. He didn't know how to handle it, how to lose control. His last attempt at manipulation crumbled, and he angrily took a step back. "You're going to regret this, Caroline," he said, his voice colder than ever. She looked at him one last time, without a trace of fear in her eyes. "Maybe, but it won't be my regret." Edward hadn't expected what happened next. As much as he was used to controlling everything around him, he could never have anticipated that Caroline would take the reins of her own life so ruthlessly. He had underestimated her strength, and now the game was over. They met again, this time not in an office or at a social event, but in a neutral place, a restaurant where they had first met. But now, something had changed. The soft candlelight and calm atmosphere did not disguise the tension between them. Edward arrived punctually, as always, with the expression of someone who believed he still held the power in the situation. But Caroline was no longer willing to surrender. She already knew what she needed to do. There was no more room for indecision or hesitation. For months, Edward had manipulated her and played with her emotions, but she was no longer the vulnerable woman he knew. She had rebuilt herself, and now he was facing a stronger, more determined version of Caroline. He smiled when he saw her come in. "I knew you'd come. We can't stay away from each other for long, can we?" Caroline didn't answer immediately. Instead, she observed his demeanor, the air of superiority he still tried to maintain. There was no longer any magic in his words, nor the seductive glow she once imagined to be irresistible. Now, all she felt was revulsion. "You know me well, Edward," Caroline said, finally breaking the silence. "But I'm not the same anymore. I'm not here to play your game anymore." Edward smiled skeptically. "You really think you can defeat me? I am who you've always wanted, Caroline. All you have to do is accept that." But Caroline was calm, focused. She leaned back in her chair, looking directly into his eyes. "I don't need you, Edward. I never did. What you offered me was an illusion, an escape from a failed marriage, an opportunity to feel power where there was emptiness. But the truth is, in trying to dominate me, you made me stronger, and that's what you never understood." Edward seemed disconcerted, but quickly tried to regain his composure. "You think you can challenge me? I can destroy your life in the blink of an eye. Don't forget what's at stake here." Caroline wasn't intimidated. She had already experienced the weight of his threats, but now they no longer held any power over her. The image Edward projected of himself as invincible was crumbling before her eyes. He was beginning to realize that he was no longer the only one in control in the room. "I know exactly what's at stake, Edward, and I'm ready to face the consequences of my choices. But unlike you, I no longer hide behind lies or manipulation. I'm the master of my own life now." The tension between them was growing, but Edward seemed to be losing control. The game he had always controlled was falling apart. He began to realize that for the first time he had nothing left to offer Caroline. Her trust had been restored, and unlike him, she was at peace with her decisions. Finally, Edward backed away. The anger he felt at having lost control was evident in his expression. He knew he had failed, but there was no going back. Caroline had broken free from him, and somehow had won the game. "You may have won this round, Caroline," he said, his voice sharp, "but I'm still in control. Don't forget that." Caroline stood up calmly, as if saying goodbye to a part of her life that no longer defined her. "I don't need control, Edward. I need freedom." Without another word, she turned her back and left, not with a hurried fleeing step, but with the confidence of someone who had finally found her way. Edward stood there, alone, in a silence that seemed deafening. He, who had always been the manipulator, now found himself in a void, with no more cards to play, no more control. Caroline had become what he never imagined she could be, independent, strong, and capable of living without him. Caroline didn't look back. When she left the restaurant, the city seemed different. The chaos of the streets, the constant noise of the cars, everything seemed insignificant now. She had taken control of her life, and that decisive step had been liberating. There was no more fear or regret. In the days that followed, Caroline faced the challenges of her new reality. She finally separated from William. The process wasn't easy, but it was necessary. The husband she had known and loved at some point no longer existed. They went their separate ways, with respect, but without any ties binding them anymore. The divorce was the end of one phase, but also the beginning of a new one. Caroline moved to a new apartment in a quiet neighborhood where no one knew her. The place was still empty, but she felt there was room for rebuilding. Loneliness no longer bothered her. She understood now that she needed to be alone to grow. She no longer depended on the opinions of others to validate her choices. What mattered, after all, was what she thought of herself. As for Edward, she knew he was still out there, but he was no longer a threatening presence in her life. He would continue trying to manipulate other people, playing his games, but Caroline would no longer be a part of it. The struggle she waged with herself and with him was more than a personal victory. It was a process of self-discovery. Caroline began to focus on her work, her friendships, and her passions. She rediscovered old hobbies, such as painting, which she had abandoned in the rush of recent years. At first, it seemed difficult, but soon she found herself absorbed in the tranquility of doing something just for herself. She also began to make new friends, people who saw her for the woman she was, and not as someone's wife or lover. In the following months, Caroline continued her journey of transformation. She didn't rush into relationships with anyone, nor did she seek to fill the void with fleeting romances. She knew that true transformation came from within, and that before seeking love, she needed to love herself. One spring morning, as she walked through the city streets, Caroline looked at her reflection in a shop window. She saw herself differently, stronger, more determined. She smiled to herself, knowing that no matter what the future held, she was ready to face it with courage. What began as a story of manipulation and desire ultimately became a story of overcoming adversity. Caroline did not become a victim of her past. She made it the force that propelled her toward a more authentic and free future. And in the end, that's what really mattered. She had finally found herself. Caroline was in an art gallery, admiring paintings by unknown artists when someone called her name. It was an old college friend, someone she had lost touch with over the years. They talked for a long time, laughing and sharing stories. As she said goodbye, Caroline smiled, feeling an inner peace she hadn't felt in a long time. She knew that life went on, with new paths and new possibilities. Sometimes the future is built on small decisions, and Caroline finally felt she had control over what was to come. Caroline's story isn't just about love, betrayal, or manipulation. It's a reminder that everyone has the capacity to reinvent themselves, even in the most difficult circumstances. If you've found yourself on this journey at some point, or if you believe that inner strength is the key to change, share your thoughts. What choices would you make if you were in Caroline's place? How do you deal with life's challenges? Your opinion could be the inspiration someone needs. Share this story and help spread the message of personal transformation.